Under the vast, unbroken sky of Nebraska's outer plains, where dirt roads run longer than the horizon and power lines are outnumbered by fence posts, Anna Beckett had built a life that asked for little and gave her peace in return. After nearly 20 years of managing regional logistics for a shipping conglomerate, a role that had left her with more ulcers than accolades, Anna had chosen to withdraw from everything with moving parts cities, people, traffic, bosses, and retreat to a 30-acre stretch of land she had purchased outright. It wasn't just property to her. It was an exhale after years of holding her breath. The farmhouse had no charm, no storybook porches or aesthetic quirks to attract attention. It was just solid, square, and hers. The land had been mostly dormant when she bought it, rough patches of dry grass, half-tilled soil, and an abandoned metal structure that looked like it used to house tractors or pigs. She had it all cleared within the first month and started planting a mixture of herbs and hardy vegetables, starting small with asparagus, beets, and certain grains that sold well to the 2 local grocers who didn't ask questions or push prices. She managed everything herself, planting, irrigation, even mechanical repairs, with the precision of someone who had built her career by running systems on tight deadlines. This wasn't a second act or a fantasy of simple country life. This was a controlled, structured withdrawal from people who assumed that proximity gave them rights over your time, your space, and your silence. It was only when a boxy black SUV pulled up unannounced at the edge of her dirt road that Anna felt the first tug of something she hadn't felt since city life: intrusion. There had been no calls, no mail, no appointments. Just the vehicle parked with idle patience, its windows tinted to the point of opacity. Anna didn't approach. She watched from the north edge of her barn, arms crossed, her hand reflexively adjusting the strap on her overalls as the door finally opened and a man stepped out. He wasn't dressed in any formal uniform, but he wore a pressed navy windbreaker with security patrol, property compliance division stitched in a clean arc across the chest. No badge, no name tag. He walked with that steady, unhurried pace of someone who had already decided that his presence was authoritative enough. Anna said nothing as he approached. He gave a slight, mechanical smile before gesturing vaguely toward her barn and saying, "We've had a few concerns come in regarding vehicle storage that may not meet local visibility standards." She narrowed her eyes, immediately alert. What concerns? And from who? The man didn't flinch. Just a courtesy check. We're part of a compliance initiative, visual uniformity for rural parcels transitioning to commercial zones. You might have received the notice? She had not. She told him so. His smile remained. Well, it could have been misfiled. It happens. She asked for ID. He deflected, pulling a folded paper from his back pocket, something that looked like an internal memo, unsigned, vague in language, and marked informational only at the top. She told him plainly that her land was private, not under any community charter or development plan, and that unless he had documentation proving otherwise, he had no standing here. The man didn't argue. He simply nodded, said he'd pass along the clarification, and left without pushing the issue. 2 mornings later, she found the sign, a thin, aluminum rectangle bolted into a metal stake, planted near the entrance to her property just before the gate. Notice, area under security observation, regional property compliance, it read. The design mimicked the signs she'd seen in more suburban developments: professional, bland, passive-aggressive in tone. But this wasn't a neighborhood. This was open land zoned independently, with no community bylaws or association memberships. She pulled the sign out of the ground and placed it in her tool shed, uncertain if it was even worth acknowledging. That evening, she reviewed her land title documents again. Everything was clean. The parcel wasn't even close to a development boundary. The county lines were clearly drawn, her zoning listed as agricultural private, with no overlap into any municipality. The next day, she emailed a contact at the local zoning office, an acquaintance from a workshop she'd attended the previous fall, just to ask if there had been any updates or district expansions. The reply came back terse and formal, stating there were no known changes. needs to her parcel's designation, and that they were not aware of any active property compliance reviews in that area. Anna didn't like that wording. Not there are none, but we're not aware. On the fourth morning, there was a concrete block at her gate. It hadn't been there the night before. It bore no writing but was clearly man-made, poured fresh and left to set directly in front of the main entry path. She called the sheriff's office not 911, but the administrative line. She explained what had been happening, listed the visits, the sign, and now this. The dispatcher listened politely and told her that unless a crime had been committed, there was little they could do. Placing a concrete block wasn't technically vandalism if it didn't damage property, and if it was on public access, it could fall under civil regulation. But Anna's road wasn't public. She had paid for it to be leveled and maintained. It was part of her land. She clarified that. The dispatcher paused, then said she'd have a deputy swing by in the coming days if someone was in the area. That was the phrase that stuck with her, if someone's in the area. It told her exactly where she stood on the priority list. Anna wasn't a person prone to panic or outbursts. Her entire professional life had trained her to navigate through breakdowns, delays, bad data, missed shipments, and untrustworthy vendors without losing her head. But what she had learned above all else was this: when someone vague comes to your door with nothing concrete but a confident tone, they're not asking, they're testing. They're waiting to see how far they can go before you push back. And if you don't push back right away, they write it down as permission. So she documented everything. She printed emails, photographed the sign and the concrete block, took time-stamped images of her gate before and after the placement. She wrote a formal letter disputing any claims of compliance enforcement, copied her lawyer in Lincoln Mason Hart, a man who specialized in rural zoning disputes and who owed her a favor from a corporate case 15 years ago, and mailed copies to the county assessor's office. Nothing happened for a week. No visits, no new signs, no blocks. Then one afternoon, while she was repairing a hinge on the greenhouse door, Anna noticed something metallic glinting in the brush line near the southern edge of her field. She walked out with a flashlight, thinking maybe it was a can or something discarded by wind. But what she found was another stake thinner this time, with a plastic cap painted bright orange. A surveyor's marker, the kind used in preliminary ground assessments. That alone wasn't alarming. Surveyors did flyovers all the time, mapping parcels for upcoming sales or assessments. But this one was driven into her side of the fence, nearly 30 feet from where her borderline officially started. She dug it out, bagged it, and that night reread the deed to her property again with a ruler in hand and overlay prints. The line wasn't even close. The marker had been planted way off grid, and not by mistake. That was when she knew it wasn't going to stop. The sign, the concrete block, the marker, none of them were official. They were props, pieces of a game someone had decided to start, and that someone was betting she didn't have the time, energy, or resources to play it back. But Anna Beckett wasn't some first-time landowner who could be shaken into compliance. She was methodical. She was precise. And now she was documenting everything. Because whatever this was, whoever was behind it, they weren't just pushing paper. They were coming for the dirt. Her dirt. And they had made their first move. Anna Beckett began the following week with a routine check of her perimeter, something she hadn't done daily before but now considered necessary. She walked the property with a clipboard, marking down the positions of newly installed game cameras she'd purchased, reviewing every fence post and gate, logging even the smallest irregularities. The incident with the surveyor's marker still hovered in her mind like smoke, no clear fire yet, but enough to irritate the senses. She sent the coordinates and photos to Mason Hart, along with a copy of her property's GPS overlay and parcel history, noting where the marker had been driven in. His reply came 6 hours later, blunt and underlined in the email, not legal, and definitely not random. That was all she needed to confirm what she already felt but wouldn't say aloud, that this was organized. These weren't missteps or procedural redundancies. They were probes, pressure points applied with deliberate ambiguity, designed to keep her guessing just long enough to allow someone else to move behind the curtain. 3 days after removing the marker, the same black SUV returned. This time it came down her drive uninvited, which was the first actionable trespass. She heard the tires crunching over the gravel while she was at the north end of the field, seeding cover crops along the ridge. The sound hit her in the chest out of place, too heavy for delivery, too casual to be urgent. She wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped out toward the road, just as the vehicle pulled up near her barn and stopped without so much as a honk or announcement. 2 men stepped out, neither was the man from the first visit. They were younger, dressed the same way, in nondescript uniforms with Property Compliance Patrol printed in subdued gray lettering across their windbreakers. The passengers stayed back, arms crossed and eyes scanning the barn. The driver approached Anna directly, flipping open a small leather folio as he walked. Inside was what looked like a folded document with a header that read Development Overlay Zone B Parcel Review Addendum. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she asked plainly, "What do you want this time?" He didn't smile, didn't offer names. He simply said, "We've been tasked with delivering notice of preliminary observation status for this property. Your parcel has been identified as a target for inclusion in upcoming regional adjustments. You'll want to review this and follow up." Anna crossed her arms, unmoved. "This land isn't under any district development plan. I've checked with the zoning office. You're wasting your time." The man's eyes didn't flinch. "That's not what our records show. Maybe you should double-check." Without another word, he folded the document, dropped it into a plastic sleeve, and clipped it to the side of her mailbox, one of the few remnants she'd replaced after the old one disappeared days ago. Then, without asking for a signature or confirming any acknowledgement, he returned to the SUV and left. No threats, no escalation. Just a drive-by notice drop that made everything look routine, which was exactly what disturbed her. She waited until they were out of sight before removing the sleeve and scanning the document. It was carefully worded, vague in tone, short on detail, padded with harmless bureaucratic language. But hidden in the text was one line that snapped her spine straight: "Failure to comply with preliminary alignment recommendations may result in regulatory assessment and classification under default participation status." It was a trap noncompliance dressed as opt-in consent. Default participation meant nothing in legal terms but sounded enough like a legal foothold to intimidate the average landowner. It was a con, a paper bluff. And that terrified her more than threats, because it meant these people were counting on landowners to panic, to surrender before anything even started. Anna didn't panic. She filed the paper, drafted a second letter to Mason Hart, and requested a formal opinion to be forwarded to the county recorder's office. She then submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the zoning board, seeking any and all communications involving her parcel's GPS coordinates over the last 6 months. She didn't expect results immediately, but putting her name on record, in writing, made it harder for any future manipulations to be brushed off as oversights. That night, as she sat at her kitchen table with maps spread out like blueprints of a war zone, she began marking a new set of symbols, cross-referencing where activity had occurred, which gates had been accessed, and where the SUV had parked. She used different colors for each day, arrows for direction, and dates for timestamps. It wasn't just preparation, it was control. Her control. The next morning, a notice appeared on her fence post. It was laminated and zip-tied tightly. The design mimicked a county government form, same font, same formatting, but upon closer inspection, no agency was listed. The document stated that her property was pending cooperative alignment under zone annexation for Corridor B3 development, and that disruption or removal of this notice may result in violation of municipal compliance protocol. She cut it down with garden shears. That afternoon she got a call not from Mason, but from the shipping supplier she'd used for the past 2 years to deliver seasonal fertilizer and bulk seed. The rep, a soft-spoken man named George who usually confirmed orders without delay, hesitated this time. Anna, I just wanted to give you a heads up. We've been advised not to fulfill orders in your quadrant. Nothing personal. We're just told to hold deliveries until zoning is clarified. Something about parcel transition status. She didn't yell, didn't argue. She asked if he had that in writing. He didn't. She thanked him, hung up, and crossed out his vendor code on her supply list. Then she spent the next 4 hours calling alternative suppliers, eventually locating a mid-size outfit 70 miles west willing to deliver, but only under the condition that the access road would be cleared and unmarked. No red flags, ma'am. We're too small to handle trouble, the dispatcher told her. That night, as she walked the perimeter again, headlamp on, flashlight ready, she noticed something else that made her stop in her tracks. A freshly dug depression near her east gate, just off the property line. She knelt down and swept her gloved hands over the dirt. It was compacted, pressed with the tread pattern of rubber soles, and inside, partially buried, was a metallic sensor. The kind used for vehicle counting. She didn't touch it. Instead, she took a photo, emailed it to Mason, and called the sheriff's administrative line. She left a detailed message and noted the coordinates. She didn't expect a callback. She went inside, locked the doors, and didn't sleep. 2 days later, Mason called. His voice was tighter than usual, less academic. They're playing a layered game, Anna. The language they're using in those notices isn't standard. It mimics statutory phrasing but lacks legal grounding. My gut tells me this is a land acquisition effort masked as regional compliance, low-grade corporate cloaking. But here's what matters. Unless someone with actual jurisdiction steps in and says stop, they'll keep pushing until you're boxed in. Anna listened quietly, then asked what he recommended. We need to trigger third-party review. There's a clause in Nebraska land law that allows independent audit if acquisition attempts are made through non-governmental entities. It's rarely used, but it's real. I'll draft the motion. You'll need to sign it and submit it in person to the county property oversight office. She agreed. The next morning, Anna drove into town, presented the motion in triplicate, and received a stamped copy with a case number. It wasn't a guarantee of protection, but it was an official recognition that her parcel was under interference. It placed her land in a legal holding pattern, freezing any documentation attempts, boundary updates, or infrastructure plans until the matter was resolved. That evening, she posted 2 new signs at her gate, custom printed, laminated, and bolted into steel posts: private property, legally disputed territory. The entry requires court order. It wasn't bluster. It was fact. And with every letter, every signature, every mile driven into town and back, Anna Beckett made it harder and harder for whoever was pushing behind the curtain to keep pretending this was just a misunderstanding. By the time Anna returned from the county office with the stamped motion in her passenger seat, she had no illusions left about the nature of what was happening. The moment she crested the final ridge and her property came back into view, the quiet hostility of the landscape confirmed everything she feared. The gate she'd left chained and locked that morning was now hanging open, not broken, not damaged, just unlocked. The signs she'd posted, legal warnings printed in bold, unmistakable language, were gone. Not removed violently or torn down in protest, just absent, as if they had never existed at all. Her breath caught in her chest, not from fear, but from a cold, infuriating calculation. Whoever had come hadn't rushed. This had been surgical. She parked her truck slowly, left the motor running, and stepped out with caution, scanning the gravel and grass for tire marks, footprints, any indication of a path taken. There were tracks, but not fresh ones. Someone had swept over them, either with a broom or another set of tires. That, more than anything, told her this was no longer just bureaucratic manipulation, it was trespass with intent. Inside, nothing had been touched. Her files were intact, the kitchen unbothered, her notes spread across the dining table just as she'd left them. But one thing was missing: the hard copy map overlay Mason had given her, the one she had annotated by hand with the boundary discrepancies and marker placements. Every other document remained. That map, just that one, was gone. She stood there for a moment, in the stillness of her home, staring at the empty spot on the table where the map had been, then calmly reached for her phone. She didn't call Mason. She didn't call the sheriff. She called a local locksmith who handled agricultural properties and requested a full overhaul, new locks, deadbolts, gate reinforcements, the works. No explanations, just specifications. The man on the line gave a long pause before replying, "You got it. I'll be there by nightfall. Bring in the heavy ones." She thanked him, hung up, and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands didn't shake. That worried her more than if they had. That evening, as the locksmith installed reinforced padlocks and replaced the gate hardware with heavy-duty crossbars, Anna walked the perimeter again, this time with a handheld floodlight. The far western edge of her property ran parallel to a utility road unmarked, mostly unused and technically public, though rarely maintained. It had never been an issue before, but now she saw signs of recent activity, tire ruts, boot prints, and what looked like a partially buried spool of orange cable near the junction box. She didn't touch it. She photographed it, recorded GPS coordinates, and made a note to include it in her next affidavit submission. She didn't know what it was, but it didn't belong to her, and it hadn't been there 2 days ago. The next morning brought a quiet tension, the kind that clings to the air after a line has been drawn and both sides wait to see who crosses first. Nothing happened that day, or the next. But on the third morning, she found the barn door ajar. She hadn't left it that way. She was meticulous, ritualistic with her checks. The door was always locked with a sliding bolt and a keyed padlock. This time the padlock was on the ground, unbroken, intact, and unlocked. Someone had used the key, or had a copy. Inside, the barn looked untouched until she noticed the gap on the shelf where she kept her spare fencing tools. A single crowbar was missing. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't unique. But it had been hers, and now it wasn't. She called Mason, her voice calm, clipped. "They've started entering structures. Took the map before, now a tool." Mason didn't reply immediately. Then he said, "Change every lock again, even the ones you just replaced. And I'll escalate the review motion we'll push for emergency injunction." Anna hung up and began calling local hardware stores to source another full lock set. Every hour wasted was a foothold for them. 2 days later, Mason submitted a formal request for an emergency hearing. The judge granted a preliminary review with restrictions, which meant that any further entry onto her land without written court approval could now be legally contested as unlawful interference. It wasn't much, but it was leverage. That night, Anna received a phone call from an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, and when she listened later, there was no voice, no noise, just the sound of a car idling for nearly 30 seconds before disconnecting. The timestamp matched the window when her perimeter sensor had briefly triggered and then gone silent. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. They were letting her know that court motions didn't scare them. The following morning, something changed. The air felt heavier, like pressure before a storm. She stepped outside with her coffee and saw 2 new signs staked at the edge of her property, just beyond the new gate hardware. They were bright, professional, double-sided. One read, "Future site of Corridor B3 development. Do not obstruct pre-construction observation." The other simply said, "Compliance zone, active review in progress." Neither bore any official seal or county endorsement, but the materials were expensive, the fonts consistent with regional signage, the language familiar enough to mislead. She walked toward them slowly, coffee cooling in her hand, eyes narrowed. As she reached out to remove them, a drone buzzed above low, intrusive, a small quadcopter model with a steady red light blinking at its base. She looked up, expression hard. It hovered for a moment, then zipped off over the fence line and out of sight. No markings, no ID tag, just another layer of pressure in a game she never agreed to play. That afternoon, Mason called with news. A local paper had received a tip that several parcels in the region were undergoing zoning reinterpretation for public infrastructure support. No names were listed, but the map attached to the leak showed Anna's property marked in red. She asked who submitted the tip. Mason said it was anonymous, probably an insider or someone from the development group pushing this plan quietly through legal gray zones. She asked if the paper had contacted her. They had not. She didn't expect them to. The following day, 2 workers arrived in an unmarked white truck. No logos, no ID. They pulled up to the edge of her field and began unloading what looked like soil testing equipment. She stepped outside, calmly, camera in hand. "You have 10 seconds to tell me who sent you and where your paperwork is." One of them muttered something about being subcontracted for early-stage analysis. Nothing official, just a preliminary data pull. She didn't move. "Show me the order. Show me who paid for this." They didn't have documents. She called Mason in their presence. He answered on speaker, voice calm, clipped. "Gentlemen, you're currently trespassing on a parcel under legal review. Any action you take from this point forward will be documented and prosecuted." The workers didn't argue. They loaded the gear back into the truck and left. She followed them halfway down the road, documenting everything. That night, she heard a pop outside around midnight, a sharp crack like a stone hitting metal. She went outside with a flashlight and found the side mirror of her truck shattered. A rock lay nearby. No footprints, no tire marks, just a message. The escalation wasn't theatrical. It wasn't cinematic. It was procedural, relentless, and maddeningly bureaucratic. She wasn't being attacked. She was being absorbed. Bit by bit, day by day, they were trying to normalize presence, distort property, manufacture ambiguity. And every step was disguised as process, as routine as something someone else had already approved. But Anna wasn't a bystander. She wasn't new. And now, she was no longer playing defense. She began drafting her own timeline of events, assembling it into a document with accompanying images, dates, and correspondence. She labeled everything: survey marker 1, sign B2, vehicle incident C3. It wasn't just for court. It was a record of resistance, proof that she had seen, documented, and endured. And when the time came, when the real questions were asked, she'd be ready with everything they thought she wouldn't bother to keep. Anna knew better than to believe the tension had peaked. In her former life, the most dangerous part of any negotiation wasn't when voices were raised, but when everything fell silent. People didn't threaten loudly when they felt confident. They grew quiet, let the machinery of procedure do the work. That same silence had now settled across her property like a cold fog. No new signs, no CVs, no drones. Even the calls had stopped. The mirror of her truck remained broken, unrepaired, a deliberate choice. She wanted the visible reminder, a crack in the routine to keep her alert. For a full week, nothing happened, and it felt far more ominous than anything she had encountered so far. Then came the envelope. It wasn't delivered through the mail or by courier. It was placed neatly between her front screen door and frame, an intrusion that made her skin crawl more than anything else. Whoever had done it had walked onto her porch, stood no more than 2 feet from the inside of her home, and left behind a single manila folder sealed with a clear sticker. No markings, no postage, just her name written in precise, machine-printed font across the front, Anna Beckett. She took it inside and placed it on the kitchen table, staring at it for several minutes before opening it, as if expecting it to trigger some mechanism or reveal a trick. But it contained only paper 9 pages, neatly stapled, formatted like a legal document, but with no signature, no official seal, and no issuing body. The header read, "Intent to enforce cooperative reclassification, notification of advanced parcel inclusion, API B3 initiative." The wording was new, and clearly not government-issued. The content, however, was anything but vague. According to the document, Anna's property had been conditionally absorbed into a voluntary compliance grid slated for alignment with emerging development corridors. The language danced between legal terminology and pure fiction phrases like conditional jurisdiction, third-party facilitation. An advanced observation phase appeared throughout the text, none of them rooted in anything she recognized from her experience or Mason's prior explanations. More alarming was the second half of the document, a list of parcels allegedly already under review. For accelerated transfer, with her own lot number at the top, followed by 7 others, some neighboring, some from the opposite side of the county. She didn't recognize most of the parcel numbers, but the pattern was unmistakable. They were targeting sparsely populated zones with little political visibility. Easy to pressure, easy to erase. Mason arrived in person the next day. He drove the 2 hours himself, not trusting phone calls or emails anymore. When Anna opened the door and saw him standing there in his old tweed coat and leather satchel, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "It escalated," she said. He nodded, already knowing. She handed him the document, and he read it slowly, lips tightening with every page. "This is an intimidation piece. No legal force, but it's crafted well enough to confuse 90% of landowners. If someone didn't have our documentation, this would look binding." He pointed to the parcel list. "This is where it gets interesting. These aren't random." Anna leaned over the table. "They're all unincorporated, right?" Mason nodded. Unincorporated, low complaint areas, mostly owned by older couples or single operators. And not a single one is under county HOA regulation. That word again. The unspoken anchor of the entire issue. Technically, Anna wasn't under any local homeowners group, nor did her land fall under the jurisdiction of any managed community zone. But whoever was behind these actions was moving like they were writing new borders. They spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the listed parcels with county zoning maps and recent development permits. Mason pulled out a separate document from his bag, an article from a trade publication that had been forwarded to him anonymously. It detailed an upcoming transportation and resource corridor project backed by a private consortium with state support, operating under the name B3 Regional Infrastructure Solutions. The group's stated mission was to facilitate seamless logistical integration between rural producers and urban markets, but the fine print revealed something else. Their funding model relied on early land acquisition through private easements and voluntary conversion charters. Anna didn't need to ask what that meant. They weren't buying the land. They were forcing landowners into agreements that resembled public use contracts, removing autonomy without transferring ownership. A legal net cast just wide enough to trap those too busy or too uncertain to fight back. Late that evening, Mason took a call outside. When he returned, his face was unreadable, but his posture was tighter, jaw clenched slightly. "That was someone I trust at the regional planning office. She says the B3 consortium filed a tentative map revision last month that included your property as a future operations hub. Not a proposal. Not a maybe. An internal model ready for rollout. They haven't submitted it formally yet, but if they do, you'll be marked as designated for transformation. Which puts you at a legal disadvantage even if your property is technically protected." Anna didn't speak. She didn't need to. The term was enough. Designated for transformation. It made her think of scorched fields, of concrete lots, of names on directories that no longer existed on mailboxes. That night, as Mason slept in the guest room, Anna sat alone at the kitchen table, papers spread in front of her like a tactical map. She didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt like something inside her had shifted, some old framework of deference, the idea that if you followed the rules, others would too. That was gone now. She wasn't angry. She was ready. The next morning they met with a private investigator, not to chase phantoms, but to gather provenance. If this group had bought its way into influence, they would have left trails, contracts, donations, changes in building code language. The investigator was blunt, practical, and came with references. He agreed to start with one of the parcels on the list, a retired couple Anna had never met, but whose land had been mentioned in the API document. If they'd received a similar notice, it would confirm the scope. Within 48 hours, the investigator returned with news. The couple, he explained, had quietly sold 2 weeks ago at a price 25% below market value. No listing, no sign. The buyer? A shell company registered 6 months earlier to a post office box in Des Moines. The kicker, the woman Margaret Knox had told a neighbor she believed the sale was mandatory because of a regional order she couldn't contest. Anna felt her stomach tighten. The trap was working, slowly, invisibly. It wouldn't come with bulldozers or court orders. It would come through paper, through language, through fatigue. The middle of any fight is where clarity begins. For Anna, the 4th week marked the turning point, not because she had won anything, but because she now understood the shape of what she was facing. This wasn't about her land alone. It wasn't even about zoning. It was about consent forced, implied, fabricated. And the only way to fight it was to strip away the comfort of ambiguity. No more benefit of the doubt. No more waiting to see what would happen next. They had made their move. Now it was her turn. The 5th week began with silence, but it didn't last long. On Monday morning, Anna awoke to the sound of a heavy engine rumbling just beyond the tree line that bordered her eastern field. At first, she assumed it was a delivery truck using the public road she had arranged a new supply chain through a cooperative 30 miles south that had agreed to discreet, cash-preferred drop-offs with no electronic records. But as she pulled on her boots and stepped outside, coffee in hand, the engine didn't fade into the distance as usual. It lingered, stationary, its idle steady and unnatural in the early calm. She walked down the slope, keeping to the edge of the fence line, moving through the tall grass like she was still part of it, until she reached a clearing with partial visibility of the dirt path that ran adjacent to her property's boundary. What she saw was not a delivery truck, not a road crew, but a flatbed trailer carrying 3 prefabricated storage units, all painted the same industrial gray, deep, with hazard-coded numbers spray-painted in yellow along their sides. One man in a reflective vest stood nearby, speaking into a radio, while another placed a series of orange flags into the ground in what appeared to be a specific grid pattern. None of them looked like county workers. None of them had badges. Anna didn't wait for explanations. She turned back toward the house, boots kicking up dust, heart steady but firm in its beat. Within minutes, she was on the phone with Mason. "There's staging equipment," she said without greeting. "East Field, just off the public easement. No signage, no ID." Mason didn't ask her to calm down. He asked for coordinates. She gave them. "Start photographing everything," he said. "Every vehicle, every crate, every person. Don't approach, just document." She grabbed her camera and returned to the clearing. By then, 2 additional trucks had arrived, one bearing what looked like telecommunications gear, the other offloading portable generators. A small temporary fencing line had been dropped, not on her land, but so close to her fence that any passerby would assume it belonged to her. It was visual annexation, an attempt to redefine ownership through presence. She took dozens of photos, logging timestamps and directional headings. The moment she returned inside, she uploaded them to a secure drive and notified Mason again. That afternoon, a new envelope appeared, this time placed not at her door, but tucked into the split of her gatepost, as though someone had walked the entire path of her drive just to insert it by hand. No postage, no name. Just a printed header, action required, non-cooperative entities. Inside were 2 pages, both styled to resemble government paperwork, with one damning line highlighted in bold red font. Failure to accommodate infrastructure alignment measures will trigger reassessment of land use designation. That night, the lights in her field flickered. Not the lights on her house, not the porch, but the solar-powered perimeter beacons she had installed near the southern gate. 3 out of 5 blinked out within a 5-minute window. As if someone had tampered with their lenses or wiring. She checked the camera footage. Nothing. A 2-minute blackout across the feed. Clean and untraceable. The kind of gap that didn't happen by accident. It was meant to remind her that documentation wasn't enough anymore. They were testing for reaction. 2 days later, the fencing crew returned. This time they crossed the line. Literally. They began installing boundary markers that intruded 10 feet into her east lot metal rods with survey tags that listed false coordinates, suggesting the edge of her property had shifted. Anna approached calmly, camera on, audio recording live. "You're trespassing," she said flatly. One of the workers, a younger man with a clipboard, replied, "We've got placement orders from Compliance Office 14 billion. She asked for a supervisor. He said none was on site. She informed them that legal jurisdiction was currently under injunction review and that any installations would be reported as violations of a court-protected parcel. The worker didn't argue. He gestured to another man to halt the digging, and after a brief discussion between themselves, they packed up and left. Not in panic, not in retreat, but with that same eerie patience that had begun to characterize every action against her, confident in the idea that the next attempt would go further. She called Mason again. He was already on it. "We file for a restraining notice. Not just for you county-wide. They've started encroaching elsewhere. You were just the test case." By the end of that week, Anna received word from a neighbor 3 miles south, another solo landowner who had heard rumors about her situation and decided to speak up. He had found similar stakes on his property, along with a packet offering pre-approval for expedited asset transition. He hadn't understood what it meant until now. Anna added his story to the file. Mason compiled the documentation into a formal brief for the Attorney General's office. It was no longer a matter for county review. The pattern was clear: a regional, coordinated attempt to force landowners into compliance through ambiguity, intimidation, and visual control. Still, the process would take time. Legal gears moved slowly, and the men behind this campaign were counting on that delay. The second escalation came not with paperwork, but with precision. On a stormy Wednesday night, just after midnight, Anna's sensor alarms triggered at the rear access gate. It was the one she used for deliveries, rarely opened, and blocked with a steel crossbar. She reached the monitor in seconds and saw nothing: no vehicles, no motion. But the alarm persisted. She threw on her coat, grabbed the flashlight, and moved through the mud-soaked path with her boots sinking half an inch into the ground. When she reached the gate, she found it partially dismantled. The bolts securing the steel bar had been loosened, one removed entirely and left hanging. No other signs of entry, no footprints, despite the wet soil. Whoever had done it had come prepared: light, quiet, clean. She resecured the bar and filed another report. The sheriff's office logged the incident but offered no comment. "Still pending review," was all they said. She didn't argue. She knew now that waiting for permission to defend her land was a waste of time. The next morning, she received a call from her insurance provider. The representative, polite but mechanical, informed her that her coverage was under review due to changes in regional land classification. She asked what changes. He couldn't specify. She asked if there was a formal notification. He said she should expect one soon. She hung up, blood thudding in her temples. They weren't just pushing her off her land physically. They were dissolving the support systems around it, service by service, one phone call at a time. That evening, she checked her utility records. Everything was in place: water, power, waste, but her billing address had been modified. The email notice now listed her land as part of pending integration Sector C. It was a digital fiction, a line of code designed to look legitimate. But it was just metadata until someone used it to justify real-world action. Anna responded the only way she knew how, by making her resistance physical. She installed motion lights at all corners of the property, replaced the perimeter beacons with wired flood lamps connected to her main grid, and reinforced her doors with commercial-grade locks. She didn't build a bunker. She didn't dig trenches. But she turned her home into what it had always been meant to be: a line no one crossed without consequence. Mason, meanwhile, pushed the case forward. The Attorney General's office had acknowledged receipt of their brief and forwarded it to the Regional Oversight Board for immediate inquiry. It wasn't a win, but it was momentum. 2 days later, the flatbed returned not to install, but to retrieve. One by one, the prefab units and generators that had been staged near her land were hauled away in silence. No explanation. No apology. Just quiet extraction. The temporary fence came down the following morning. When Anna checked the clearing, she found no trash, no marks, nothing left behind except a laminated note staked into the soil. It read, Project Corridor B3 rescheduled. Future access pending. No signature. No seal. Just a placeholder for the next move. Anna didn't take it as a retreat. She took it as a reset. They were regrouping, waiting to see if the legal pushback would hold or collapse under bureaucracy. She didn't wait to see what they'd do next. She doubled her logs, contacted local news outlets through off-record channels, and began preparing a series of statements truthful, documented, non-alarmist. Not for the media. For the state. For when they would eventually be forced to investigate. And as the sun set over her field that evening, the dirt undisturbed, the gates locked, the lights humming, Anna stood on her porch and knew, without a flicker of doubt, that this was far from over. But she was still standing, and that, for now, was enough. She found the envelope in the secure drop box she had been using ever since the mailbox at her gate was ripped out of the ground and replaced with silence. This one wasn't another anonymous warning printed in vague bureaucratic language. It carried the seal of the State Land Oversight Division, the kind of marking that came with accountability. She didn't open it in the truck. She drove all the way back to the farmhouse, left the engine running for a moment longer than usual, and walked inside without rushing. She knew the tone of state paper. No one sends these unless something is about to shift. When she opened it, her hands didn't shake. The document was formal, stiff, full of legal phrases she didn't need to Google. It was a preliminary injunction against any administrative action regarding her property and 4 others identified during the investigation into the B3 development. According to the letter, her parcel had been wrongfully subjected to jurisdictional overreach, coercive compliance measures, and unverified development alignment notices. The freeze was not permanent, but it was enforceable, and it meant that anyone attempting to approach her land with another pretense of authority would now be legally exposed. She didn't celebrate. She knew this kind of win only forced the game underground. The first sign came quietly. In the morning, while walking her field lines, she found 2 sets of fresh footprints near the back gate. They were shallow, clean, pressed with modern rubber soles, not boots, not utility workwear, but the kind used by surveyors or field agents. No attempt to cover them, no tire marks, no obvious tracks leading in or out. Just presence. She logged them, took photos, and emailed Mason with coordinates and timestamps. She didn't bother calling the sheriff. That part of the playbook was already obsolete. 2 parcels on the list owners she hadn't even met had reported similar activity. One had equipment vandalized, solar panels shattered, cable lines stripped and left coiled in the dirt. Another had a feed delivery intercepted and rerouted without consent. Both reported it through Mason's network. There were no direct threats, only patterns. Paperwork had moved the conflict into public view, but not everyone behind this operation was ready to stand down. Then came the black van. It arrived just past dusk and parked at the edge of the public access road, facing the gate. It didn't cross onto her property. No one stepped out, no lights turned on. It simply sat there, as if waiting for acknowledgement. For the better part of an hour, she didn't move from the porch. She watched it while it watched her, the outline barely visible in the dark. When it eventually pulled away, it did so slowly, deliberately, kicking up just enough dust to blur its plates without obscuring intent. She didn't document it with photos. She didn't need to. It wasn't for evidence. It was for atmosphere. They wanted her to feel boxed in again. She didn't give them that. The fire came next. It started at the edge of the equipment shed, Near the batteries she'd moved after the last grid inspection. The flames reached high, fast, accelerated in a way that suggested something had been tampered with. She caught it before it spread to the barn, thanks to the suppression foam system she'd installed a month earlier. The local fire team arrived late and left early, issuing a soft report about possible electrical failure. No one wanted to write down arson. It would mean paperwork, and no one liked paperwork when it wasn't theirs. She called Mason the next morning. He told her bluntly they're done pretending. The audit had uncovered contract trails leading back to a holding company based 3 states away, with shell acquisitions and internal memos that referenced expedited compliance transitions. In legal terms, it meant the entire corridor project was under review, and all related ground operations had been suspended. But that was the state. Out here, it only meant the money had paused, not the people. The oversight agents arrived soon after. This time they brought credentials that carried weight, and they didn't ask for permission to walk the land, only courtesy. She gave them full access. Together, they documented the buried sensors, the shifted markers, the laminated threats she'd stored in the shed, and the original compliance notices. One of them, a woman with a lined face and the kind of posture that came from years of sitting in legislative hearings, told her flatly, "This is one of the most complete field records we've seen. What you've done here isn't just about defending your land. It's evidence that will outlast this case." Anna nodded but didn't reply. She knew better than to treat words like that as anything more than an observation. That evening, after the agents left, she walked the fields again, checking each gate, each fence post, each camera. Nothing was out of place. No signs of new visits. No paper tucked under latches. For the first time in weeks, the air felt still, like the land had finally caught its breath. She stood under the sky, eyes fixed on the flat black above her, and realized she hadn't thought about the stars in weeks. The fight had taken every angle of her attention, every rhythm of her days. But now, standing there, she understood something new. The land wasn't quiet because the conflict was over. It was quiet because now every side was watching the other from across a flat, tense field, waiting to see who would blink next. And then, without sound, without a vehicle, without anyone stepping foot on her soil, a message appeared. In her private inbox, one she hadn't used in years, locked behind credentials she assumed were obsolete, there sat a single, new message. No sender, no subject, just a line of text that read, "This doesn't end with paperwork." She didn't flinch. She didn't reply. She archived the message, turned off the screen, and stepped back out onto the porch. This time she didn't turn on the light. Anna didn't expect quiet to feel this strange. In the weeks following the fire and the state oversight team's visit, there had been no new signs, no vehicles idling at the edge of her property, no laminated warnings stapled to the gate. The flatbed trucks that had once dropped fencing posts and unmarked storage units were gone. The equipment shed was still damaged, but she chose not to repair it right away. The blackened timbers stood like a reminder, a warning of what silence could mask. She wasn't naive enough to think it was over. She knew better than that. There was too much momentum, too much money on the line, and the machine behind all this, whatever mix of private development, political cooperation, and logistical subversion had created, it wouldn't unravel just because she had won one round of paperwork. But it had paused. That in itself was unusual enough to warrant caution. The state inquiry had entered its formal review phase, which meant meetings were being held behind closed doors. Draft language was circulating between lawyers and regional administrators, and people who had once approved plans without reading them were now looking for ways to distance themselves. Mason kept her informed, forwarding her redacted memos and internal correspondence that hinted at what was being said in rooms she'd never see. Phrases like misapplication of conditional annexation procedures and undisclosed jurisdictional fluidity began to surface bureaucratic translations for "we got caught." One document even suggested the formation of a task force to audit all third-party contractors working on corridor development projects statewide. It was progress, but not closure. It was reaction, not accountability. Still, she understood that, in this world, you measured victories by what didn't happen next. Her land remained intact. The fields were hers again. No new survey stakes appeared. Deliveries resumed without issue. The insurance review was quietly reversed with no apology, and her billing profile with the utility board was restored to its original, accurate classification. One by one, the small intrusions began to retreat, as if each department that had once participated in her slow erasure was now trying to cover its tracks. She received no phone calls, no letters. Even the text messages had stopped. But she knew better than to call it peace. Anna kept her logs up to date. She didn't relax her perimeter checks. The cameras stayed online. The backup archives continued to mirror across 3 servers in 3 separate locations. She didn't do this out of fear, she did it because the attempt had already happened once, and there was no guarantee it wouldn't begin again under a different name, with new actors, cleaner papers. The soil doesn't forget being claimed, even if the ink washes off the map. One afternoon, as she was repairing the irrigation line that ran along the west fence, she noticed a new face standing just beyond her boundary, an older man in worn denim, arms crossed, looking not at her but at the tree line behind her. When she stood up and approached, he stepped back slightly, holding up his hands in a neutral gesture. He introduced himself as Richard Bell, owner of a 10-acre property several miles east, one of the parcels she had seen listed in that original cooperative compliance notice. He said he'd heard about what she did, what she documented, what she refused to sign, how she stood firm. He said others were talking now, quietly, cautiously. Some who'd signed too quickly were trying to reclaim what they could. Some were considering lawsuits. Most didn't know where to start. He wasn't asking for help, not directly. He just wanted to say it mattered. Anna didn't say much in response. She wasn't interested in becoming anyone's symbol. She hadn't done this to inspire or lead. She had done it because her land wasn't a theory, it was real, and no one had the right to take it. But she thanked him. She offered him water. And she gave him Mason's name, written on a card she kept in a sealed tin by the back door, just in case. Later that evening, she reviewed the most recent memo from the Oversight Committee. It outlined their plan to issue formal warnings to the development group behind the B3 corridor, suspend their operating licenses pending outcome of the investigation, and notify all landowners affected by unauthorized notices. The memo ended with a phrase that struck her as both honest and insufficient. Landowners who experience procedural discrepancies are encouraged to contact legal representation. It was the closest the state would come to saying, "We left the door open, and you were the one who had to keep them out." In the months that followed, the land began to feel normal again, though the word meant something different now. Normal didn't mean safe. It meant active vigilance. She no longer assumed her fences were untouched simply because they looked undisturbed. She no longer believed that silence meant respect. But she slept through the night. She walked her property without looking over her shoulder. And when she stood on the porch in the evening with the sun dipping below the ridge, she didn't feel like a trespasser in her own life. She never received a formal apology. No one from the development group ever called, wrote, or acknowledged the fight. But she didn't need them to. The records existed. The inquiry was public. And her name was on every page. One morning, a new sign arrived. Not a warning. Not a threat. A wooden placard carved cleanly and mailed without return address. On it, a single phrase this land held. There was no signature. She hung it above the doorway to the barn, not as a triumph, but as truth. Because that was what it came down to in the end. Not slogans, not gestures, just the simple fact of standing when you were told to move, holding ground when others blurred the lines, and refusing, even in the quiet, to forget where the fence line was drawn.